I rented the cabin because I needed silence. It was February, the middle of winter, and northern Michigan was buried under snow. The roads were lined with tall white banks, and the lake nearby was frozen solid, flat and gray under the pale sky. I wanted a week to myself to write without distraction, and the listing for the cabin promised peace and privacy. It was a one-room place, simple but comfortable. A wood stove, a small kitchenette, a narrow bed, and a window that looked out toward the frozen trees. The nearest town was about 15 minutes away by car, and even that was small, with only a gas station, a diner, and a hardware store. When I arrived, the air was so still that I felt like the world had gone empty. No cars passed, no people walked by. It was the kind of silence you don't get in regular life, a heavy silence that presses on your ears. The first day passed quietly. I unpacked, stacked some wood inside, and set up my laptop on the little table by the window. Snow fell slowly that night, flakes drifting past the glass, and I wrote until my eyes burned. I had no trouble sleeping. The isolation felt good at first, like I was cut off from everything that usually distracted me. On the second day, the quiet started to feel heavier. When I stepped outside for fresh air, I realized how deep the snow was. Came up to my knees when I walked around the cabin. Every step made that crunching sound, sharp in the stillness. I circled the place once, just to get a feel for my surroundings. To the back of the cabin, there was a woodshed with a slanted roof and a door that leaned slightly on its hinges. Firewood was stacked against one side, covered in a thin layer of ice. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went back in, made coffee, and sat by the stove. That evening, I noticed the footprints. I had gone out just before dark to bring in more firewood, and when I turned toward the shed, I froze. Tracks in the snow led to the door. They weren't mine. They came from the tree line about 30 feet away, a single trail of boots pressing down into the fresh snow, and they stopped right at the shed. I knew I hadn't gone near it since the day before, and I had circled only once, nowhere close to that door. My chest felt tight as I stood there staring. The sky was dimming to purple, the woods behind the shed thick and shadowy. I told myself maybe it was an old set of tracks, but I knew the snow had fallen steadily all day. These prints were clear, edges sharp, pressed fresh. Whoever made them had been here after the snow stopped. I forced myself to the shed, my boots sinking deep with each step. When I pulled the door open, the smell hit me first. Cigarette smoke, faint but sharp in the cold air. I pushed the door wide, and that was when I saw it. Behind the stacked firewood, half hidden, there was an old sleeping bag rolled loosely. A crushed pack of cigarettes sat beside it, the cardboard bent and damp. My stomach dropped. Someone had been staying there, someone close enough to watch me through the cabin windows if they wanted. I backed away fast, shut the shed door, and hurried inside. My hands shook as I dropped the wood near the stove. That night, I shoved a chair under the cabin's front door handle, though I knew the door itself wasn't solid enough to stop anyone determined. Every creak of the logs in the stove, every snap of wind outside, made me jolt awake. I barely slept, my ears straining for footsteps in the snow or the sound of the door moving. When morning came, I felt weak with exhaustion. Pale light filled the cabin. I went back to the shed, careful, my boots crunching the frozen crust. The sleeping bag was gone. So were the cigarettes. The floor inside looked disturbed, as if someone had dragged their things out in a hurry. There were new prints leading back into the woods, disappearing into the distance. I stood there for a long time, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The snow around the shed was marked by boot prints, proof that whoever had been there knew I'd found their hiding spot. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees watching me. I didn't feel safe in the cabin after that. Even in daylight, I couldn't focus on writing. Every shadow outside the window made me flinch. The silence, which had felt peaceful before, now felt threatening. If I stepped outside, I scanned the tree line, looking for movement. I thought about the person in the shed, how close they had been to me, how they had chosen to stay hidden until I found their things. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in the bed. I sat in the chair near the stove, listening, the chair still wedged under the door handle. The hours dragged. I kept imagining what I'd do if I heard the crunch of footsteps outside, if the knob started to turn. Nothing happened, but the weight of waiting pressed down harder than anything else. By the third morning, I had made my decision. I packed my bag quickly, tossing everything into the trunk of my car. I didn't bother folding clothes, didn't make coffee, didn't look back at the cabin when I left. The snow crunched under my tires as I pulled onto the narrow road, the trees closing in on either side. My heart pounded the entire drive back to town, and I didn't stop until I reached a gas station with people around, voices, and the hum of traffic on the highway. Even now, I think about it. Whoever had been living in that shed had probably been there before I arrived, tucked out of sight, watching. Maybe they had no plan to hurt me, maybe they just needed a place to stay. But they had stood in the same snow I walked through, only feet from where I slept, close enough to know I was alone. The worst part wasn't the footprints, or even the sleeping bag. It was waking up to find it gone, knowing they had come back in the night while I lay awake inside the cabin, too afraid to move. I never told the rental owner. I didn't want to explain what I'd seen, or admit how careless I had been staying out there alone. But when I think back to those days, the memory that sticks isn't the silence or the snow or even the cold. It's that faint smell of cigarettes, clinging to the air inside the shed, proof that for a while, the cabin hadn't really been mine at all. The rental cabin I stayed in was about as quiet as you'd expect from a place tucked in the middle of nowhere. It sat at the edge of a dirt road that wound off the highway, surrounded by tall pines and a small clearing that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The owner had told me there were only 2 cabins on that stretch of land. Mine, which was ready for guests, and another one about 100 yards away. He said that second one was empty, under renovation. His words. I didn't think much of it when I first arrived. The idea of having another cabin nearby actually gave me a little comfort, like I wasn't completely alone. The first day went by without anything strange. I unpacked my bag, set my food in the little fridge, and sat out on the porch for a while just listening to the woods. The air was clean and sharp, the kind of quiet you only hear when you're hours away from the nearest town. By late afternoon, I walked around the property, stretching my legs after the drive. That's when I noticed the other cabin. It was set back a little, half hidden behind trees, but you could still see it from the edge of mine. From a distance, it looked shut up tight. The windows looked dark, and the roof line sagged a bit, like nobody had been in there for a long time. On the second day, though, I saw smoke rising from its chimney. At first, I thought maybe someone had arrived, maybe construction workers or the owner checking in. But when I remembered what the property manager had told me, that nobody was supposed to be staying there, it made me pause. The smoke wasn't faint either. It was steady, like someone had a fire going for warmth. I watched it for a while, thinking maybe I was mistaken, but it kept coming, a thin gray column against the tree line. That night, after it had gotten dark, I noticed a flicker inside the other cabin. A flashlight beam moved across the windows, quick bursts of light cutting through the glass like someone was walking around inside. I turned off the lamp in my own cabin so I could see better and sat by the window. The light kept shifting, first in one room, then another. It wasn't constant, but it was enough to tell me someone was definitely in there. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it. Every time the sun went down, I saw movement in those windows. The figure wasn't clear, but it was obvious. Someone was pacing, sometimes slow, sometimes fast, back and forth across the rooms. I couldn't hear anything from my place, but just watching the shape pass behind the glass was enough to put me on edge. I kept telling myself maybe the owner had rented it without saying anything, or maybe a squatter had found their way in. Either way, it didn't sit right with me. I decided to mention it the next morning when I called the property manager about a small plumbing issue I was having with the kitchen sink. While I had him on the phone, I brought up the other cabin. I told him I had seen smoke and lights, that it looked like someone was inside. He didn't even hesitate. He said flat out that nobody was there. He repeated that it was under renovation and locked up. I pushed a little, told him exactly what I'd seen, but he brushed it off. said maybe I saw leftover smoke from a chimney that had been lit before, or maybe light reflecting through the trees. The way he dismissed it so quickly made me uneasy. He was either lying or didn't care enough to look into it. That night, I stayed up late on purpose, sitting near the window again. Sure enough, the lights started. Flashlight beams again, moving quickly this time, almost frantic. Then the pacing shadow returned. I counted how long it kept going, nearly an hour back and forth. At one point, I thought I saw the figure stop at the window, just stand there like it was staring out. Even though it was too dark to see clearly, the thought of someone looking back toward me made my chest tighten. I turned away, shut my curtains, and sat on the couch trying to focus on the silence in my cabin instead. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard faint crunches outside, like footsteps over the gravel and pine needles. I told myself it was just animals, but the sound pattern felt too steady. I stayed still, staring at the ceiling until dawn started breaking. The next day, I walked the long way around my cabin, keeping my eyes on the other one. It looked empty again, quiet, like nothing had ever happened. No smoke, no movement, but I noticed the ground. Between the trees, the dirt and needles looked pressed down, like there had been a path made from footsteps going back and forth. The marks led straight from the woods to the other cabin's porch. That was the first time I felt real fear. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it felt almost silly. I hadn't actually seen anyone's face. For all I knew, maybe there really was some worker staying there without the manager telling me. I tried to push through the day, reading a book, taking a walk near the lake, but the unease never left. When night came, I left all the lights in my cabin off and sat at the table with a clear view out the window. Around 9, I saw it again, movement in the window across the clearing. The pacing started earlier this time. The shadow crossed and crossed again. I leaned closer, trying to see if I could make out any features, but it was just a vague dark shape. Then the flashlight beam clicked on, scanning across the room. It stopped at the window again, held steady for longer than usual. That's when I realized it wasn't random. Whoever was inside had noticed me before, and now they were standing there, watching. I dropped down under my window frame, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stayed crouched there for what felt like forever, waiting. When I finally dared to peek, the light was gone, but the pacing had stopped too. The window was dark, still. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every little creak and pop of the cabin walls set me on edge. Around 2 in the morning, I swore I heard soft movement outside, close to my porch, but I didn't dare look. I stayed in bed with my knife from the kitchen clenched in my hand, staring at the shadows until the sun rose. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my bag as quickly as I could, tossing everything into the trunk of my car. Before I left, I couldn't help but glance toward the other cabin one last time. In the daylight, it looked still dead. No smoke, no light, just a silent shell of a building. But on the porch, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A chair had been dragged out, sitting at an angle facing directly toward my cabin. It wasn't old or weathered. It looked like it had been used recently. Whoever had been inside wasn't just pacing. They had been watching me. That was enough. I got in my car, turned the key, and drove down that dirt road without looking back again. I didn't call the property manager. I didn't try to argue or prove what I'd seen. I just left. The thought of staying another night with that cabin standing across from me, knowing someone was inside when they weren't supposed to be, was more than I could take. Even now, weeks later, I still picture that chair on the porch pointed right at me. It makes me wonder how many nights, while I was watching those shadows in the windows, someone was sitting there in the dark, watching me right back. We had planned the trip for weeks. A small cabin by the lake sounded like the perfect break from the constant noise of work, traffic, and screens. My wife wanted a quiet place to read. I wanted to fish a little, and the kids wanted to run around without being told to stay out of the street. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom wooden place with a small kitchen, a living room that smelled faintly of old firewood, and a porch that looked out over the water. There was another cabin about a quarter mile down the shore, but from where we stood, it felt like we had the whole lake to ourselves. The first night passed quietly. The air was cooler than I expected, so before bed I made sure every window was closed and latched. I don't know why, but I've always had this habit when staying in new places. I go around checking doors and windows twice, sometimes 3 times. My wife laughs at me for it, says I worry too much, but it helps me sleep. That night, after tucking the kids in, I checked every window. Each latch was down tight. The second night was when things started to feel different. I woke up shivering in the middle of the night. The blanket was pulled up around me, but the air had that sharp chill that only comes from outside. I sat up and turned toward the window next to the bed. It was cracked open, maybe 2 inches. My stomach dropped. I was sure I had latched it the night before. I leaned over and shut it firmly, hearing the metal catch click into place. I pulled the curtains together tight, then lay back down, staring at the ceiling for a long time. I told myself it must have been me. Maybe I didn't press the latch hard enough. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had pushed it open. The next morning, I didn't mention it. I didn't want to worry my wife or make it sound like I was paranoid. The kids were running around on the shore, skipping rocks, yelling at each other, their voices bouncing off the water. I tried to focus on that. But as the day went on, I caught myself glancing back at the cabin windows again and again. Each time they were shut, curtains hanging still. That night, I repeated my ritual, checked every window, pressed every latch, and even pulled on them to make sure they wouldn't budge. I double-checked the front and back doors too, sliding the bolt across. The woods around us were pitch black, the kind of dark that made you realize how far from town you were. No streetlights, no passing cars, just the occasional rustle in the trees and the soft lap of the lake against the shore. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I felt a hand shake my shoulder. My wife was leaning over me, whispering that she'd seen something. I sat up quickly, my heart racing before I even knew what she meant. She pointed at the window on her side of the bed. Her voice was shaking when she said there had been a shadow pressed against the glass. For a few seconds, I just sat there, listening. The cabin was silent except for my own breathing, but my skin crawled like we weren't alone. I slid out of bed and stood there, waiting. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and I moved slowly toward the window. The curtain was drawn, but a faint outline of the trees was visible through the thin fabric. I didn't see anything move, but my stomach twisted like I had already missed it. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, every second stretched out, the boards under my feet creaking with the smallest shifts of weight. Finally, I stepped back and told her quietly to try to rest. I didn't believe the words myself. The rest of the night, I lay awake listening. Every crack of wood settling in the walls, every groan of wind against the cabin made me tense up. I thought I heard faint noises outside at one point, like steps in the dirt, slow and careful, circling the house. I never got up to look. I didn't want to see anything I couldn't explain. At dawn, when the first light started to push through the trees, we didn't even need to talk about it. We packed our bags quickly, waking the kids and telling them we were leaving early. My wife moved faster than I'd ever seen her, stuffing clothes into bags without folding them. I carried everything out to the car in long trips, glancing around the woods each time I stepped onto the porch. The air felt heavy, the silence thicker than before, as if someone was just beyond sight, waiting. When I walked back inside for the last load, I stopped in the bedroom. The window beside the bed, the one I had checked so carefully, was cracked open again. Not wide, just an inch, but enough. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening. I knew I had latched it. I remembered pressing down on it hard enough to hear the metal scrape. I shut it again, pushed the latch down until my thumb hurt, then left without saying anything. We drove away as the sun climbed over the trees, and I didn't look back at the cabin. On the way home, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe the latches were old. Maybe the wood had warped over the years and they didn't hold the way they should. Maybe my wife had only imagined the shadow, half asleep in the middle of the night. But the truth was, I didn't believe that. I had felt it too, that uneasy weight, that sense of someone watching. It wasn't a ghost story. And it wasn't some wild animal. The windows didn't open themselves. Someone had been out there. Someone had come close enough to press their face against the glass while we slept. And that thought stayed with me long after we left, heavier than anything else. The idea that whoever it was might still be out there, waiting for the next family to rent the cabin, waiting for another unlocked moment. I never told the kids what happened, and I only spoke about it once with my wife when we were back home unpacking. She didn't want to talk about it. I could tell by the way her hands shook when she folded clothes back into drawers. We never said we wouldn't go back to that cabin, but neither of us has suggested another trip since. And I know even if we do take another getaway someday, I'll never be able to fall asleep the same way again, not without thinking of that window sliding open in the dark, and not without wondering how long someone had been standing just outside watching us through the glass. I rented a small fishing cabin in Ontario for a week in late September. The weather had just started turning cold. The trees around the lake had begun to change color, and the mornings carried that heavy mist that hangs low over the water. The cabin was simple, with stove, one bedroom, no electricity except for a small generator I only ran in the evenings, and a dock that stretched out into the lake. It was the kind of quiet that you don't hear anywhere near towns. Even the wind seemed slower there. I spent my first couple of days mostly on the water, fishing for pike and walleye. When I wasn't out in the canoe, I was splitting wood or cooking simple meals on the propane stove. I had no cell service, just a small radio for weather updates. I wasn't expecting to see anyone out there. The nearest road was almost an hour's hike down a dirt trail, and I hadn't passed another cabin on the way in. On the third afternoon, after I came in from fishing, there was a knock at the cabin door. It startled me because I hadn't seen another person since I left town. When I opened it, a young man stood there. He looked to be in his 20s, maybe a bit younger than me. His clothes were muddy, brown jacket, worn-out jeans, scuffed boots. His hair looked like it hadn't been washed in days, and there was something nervous in the way his eyes darted around. He asked if I had seen his friend, who had gone into the woods to set traps the day before and hadn't come back. I told him no, I hadn't seen anyone. I thought it was odd that he was out there without gear, no pack, not even a flashlight that I could see. He just nodded, looked past me into the cabin for a second too long, and then said he would keep looking. He walked off down the path that led toward the tree line. I didn't think much more of it right then, but the whole thing left me uneasy. Later, when the sun had dropped low, I went outside to bring in some firewood. That was when I noticed him again. The same young man was standing at the edge of the woods, maybe 50 yards back, just at the tree line. He wasn't moving. He wasn't calling for his friend. He was just standing there, looking in the direction of the cabin. At first I thought maybe he had gotten lost or was waiting for his buddy, but the longer I watched, the stranger it felt. He never stepped forward, never waved, never said a word. I went back inside and shut the door, trying to convince myself he had a reason to be out there. I kept checking through the small window as the light faded, but by the time it was dark, I couldn't see him anymore. I sat by the wood stove for a long while, listening to the fire crackle and the occasional pop of the logs. I told myself he had probably gone deeper into the woods. Still, I found it hard to settle. That night, sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just an animal. Then I realized it was the steady crunch of footsteps on the gravel and pine needles around the cabin. Slow, measured steps. They circled the cabin, moving from one side to the other. The sound stopped for a few seconds, then started again, always at the same pace. I lay in bed holding my breath, trying to keep the mattress from creaking under me. The cabin was small, and every sound outside carried clear inside. Whoever it was circled the cabin for what felt like forever. Every time the steps paused, I felt sure the door would rattle or the window would creak open, but it never happened. Eventually, the sound faded off toward the woods, and the silence pressed in again. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling in the dark until the sky outside started to lighten. As soon as it was bright enough, I went out to look around. The ground was damp from the night air, and sure enough, there were tracks all around the cabin, boot prints, not animal. They circled in a wide loop, weaving close to the windows and then back out again. I followed them a short way into the trees, but they scattered off in different directions, like the person had paced or doubled back. I didn't want to go too far. I decided to call the rangers as soon as I got the generator running. The radio had a direct channel. I told them about the man who had knocked on my door, about the footsteps circling the cabin, and about the boot prints. They said they would send someone out to check. By mid-morning, 2 rangers came on an ATV. They were calm but serious as they walked the perimeter, studying the tracks. I explained again what had happened, every detail I could remember. They asked me questions, what the man looked like, what he was wearing, which way he had gone after I first saw him. Then they went into the woods to search. I stayed by the cabin, keeping the fire going and waiting. Hours passed before they came back. They said they hadn't found anyone. No sign of a camp, no traps, no belongings, nothing that would suggest someone else was living out there. They didn't seem surprised, though. One of them told me that sometimes drifters or squatters wander through those parts, and that they usually move on when they realize someone else is around. They said they would keep an eye out, but there wasn't much else they could do. After they left, the silence around the cabin felt heavier than before. Every little sound in the woods caught my attention. The snap of a branch, the distant call of a bird, the splash of a fish at the lake. I stayed another night, but I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind shifted, I thought I heard someone outside again. The rest of the week passed without another sighting, but the unease never left me. I kept checking the tree line, half expecting to see that figure standing there again. On the last day, when I packed up and loaded the canoe, I found myself rushing, like I needed to get out before dark. I don't know who that man was, or if he ever really had a missing friend. Maybe he was lying, maybe he was hunting for something else, or maybe he really was lost and desperate. All I know is that he was there, watching, circling my cabin in the middle of the night, and then gone without a trace. When I finally got back to the main road and cell service, I called the ranger station again to ask if they had found anything in the days after. They told me no. No missing person report, no signs in the woods, nothing. Just me, the cabin, and the memory of footsteps that circled in the dark. I still think about it sometimes, mostly at night when I'm lying in bed and the house is quiet. I'll hear the creak of a floorboard or the wind pushing against the window, and for a second I'll remember the sound of boots crunching outside, steady and patient, going around and around until they disappeared into the trees. I drove up to the cabin in Colorado with the idea that a week alone in the mountains would clear my head. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and I wanted silence, fresh air, and nothing else. The cabin was an old hunting place a coworker had recommended. It was small, just one main room with a cot, a wood stove, and a little table. There was a porch that faced the trees and a view of the slope behind the clearing. The road ended about half a mile down, so I had carried my bag and food supplies up by hand. It felt out of the way in a way I liked. The first day went by quietly. I stacked some firewood, checked the stove, and made myself dinner. It got cold fast once the sun dipped, and by night the wind made the walls creak. I noticed right away how dark it was. With no nearby towns or houses, the darkness outside pressed against the windows. I remember sitting at the table that first night, listening to the crack of the fire, feeling both calm and uneasy at the same time. It was the kind of quiet that made every sound stand out, even the shifting of the cabin frame or a squirrel darting over the roof. I slept lightly, waking a few times, but nothing seemed unusual. The second morning, I stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee in hand. That's when I saw it. A soup can sat on the porch floor right near the steps. It was empty, with the lid still attached but bent back, sharp edge shining in the morning sun. I hadn't brought any canned soup with me. All the food I carried up was dry goods, pasta, oats, and a few sealed packages. At first I thought maybe someone before me had left it behind and it somehow rolled out. The cabin had no trash bin outside, but there had been a small pile of wood scraps near the side. Maybe it had been hidden there and the wind knocked it free. I set it on the table inside and didn't think much more about it. That day I hiked a little along the ridge, took some photos of the valley, and came back by late afternoon. The quiet was heavy again as the sky darkened, but I tried to ignore it. I read a little, wrote in a notebook, and went to bed early. The third morning, when I opened the door, I froze. Another can sat right at the threshold. This one was crushed flat like someone had stepped on it. It wasn't there the night before. I was sure of it. The porch was clean when I went inside. I crouched down and stared at it, trying to find some reasonable explanation. Maybe an animal dragged it there. But what animal would crush a can like that and place it directly in front of the door? I looked out at the clearing, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was still, but I had the sudden sense of being watched. I picked up the can and put it next to the first one inside. My hands shook a little, though I tried to tell myself I was being ridiculous. I went about the morning, made breakfast, swept the porch. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The woods felt different. Every sound outside now seemed sharper, closer. That night was the worst sleep I had yet. The stove had gone out around midnight, and I woke up cold. As I lay there, listening to the silence, I swore I heard something faint, maybe metal shifting or a soft scrape against wood. I didn't move. I just stared at the ceiling until the sound stopped. The fourth morning, my stomach sank the second I stepped outside. 3 cans sat lined up neatly on the porch railing. Not scattered, not dropped, but placed with intention. One of them was the same crushed can from before. The other 2 were intact but empty, their sharp lids peeled back. They were arranged in a perfect row, each one spaced evenly apart. I stood there for a long time, not touching them, just staring. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. That meant someone had been at the cabin during the night, close enough to place them without waking me. The nearest other cabin was miles away. The road below wasn't traveled by anyone who wasn't headed up here. If someone had hiked in, they would have to know I was here, watching the cabin, waiting for me to sleep. The feeling that washed over me was not confusion anymore, but dread. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat at the table. The walls felt too thin, the windows too wide. Whoever it was, they wanted me to see those cans. They wanted me to know they were here. I packed slowly, keeping the shades drawn. My bag wasn't big, but I crammed in my clothes, notebook, and whatever food was left. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone at the edge of the clearing. The cans stayed where they were on the railing. Before leaving, I checked the back of the cabin. Near the woodshed, I noticed flattened grass, like someone had stood there often. Cigarette butts were pressed into the dirt. That sent a shiver through me. I don't smoke. No one had mentioned anyone else being up here. Whoever had left those was close, maybe watching me when I carried wood earlier, maybe standing there the night I thought I heard the scrape against the cabin wall. I slung my bag over my shoulder and walked fast down the trail to the road. Every sound made me turn. My heart raced the whole way until I reached my car. Once inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back at the clearing. On the way down the mountain, I kept replaying it in my head, trying to explain it away. Maybe some kids had come up and decided to mess around. But kids don't hike miles up a mountain just to place soup cans in a row. And the cigarette butts, the crushed can by the door, those weren't accidents. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. Only then did I breathe easier, but the unease never fully left. I thought about how quiet the woods had been, how easy it would be for someone to stand just out of sight, waiting, moving closer each night. The cans were a message, though I still don't know what it meant. Maybe it was a warning, maybe a game, maybe something worse. I haven't gone back to that cabin, and I won't. When I think about it now, what unsettles me most isn't the cans themselves, but the idea that someone was there the whole time, watching, waiting for me to notice. The forest had felt empty, but it wasn't. I had never really been alone up there. I stayed at a small rental cabin in Vermont with my girlfriend last winter. We wanted something quiet, away from the noise of the city, a place where we could just relax for a few days. The pictures online made the cabin look warm and cozy, with wood paneling, a stone fireplace, and a little porch that looked out onto the woods. It seemed perfect, like the kind of cabin you see on postcards. The listing mentioned that it had 2 bedrooms, one upstairs and one on the main floor. But when we got there, we noticed right away that one of the bedrooms was locked. The door was shut tight with a deadbolt on the outside, which felt strange. The host had messaged me earlier saying that the second bedroom was being used for storage and that it wasn't available for guests. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Lots of hosts keep a room for their own things, and it didn't seem like a big deal. The first night was uneventful. We arrived late in the afternoon, brought in our bags, and lit a fire. Snow had started falling not long after we pulled into the driveway, and by evening, the trees outside were coated white. The cabin had a calm silence that I wasn't used to, the kind of quiet where you could hear the creaks of the wood settling and the faint hum of the wind outside. It was nice, in a way, almost too nice. We drank wine, made dinner in the little kitchen, and went to bed early. I remember lying there and noticing how dark it was. No streetlights, no glow from cars, nothing. Just blackness pressing in from the woods. The second night, I noticed something odd. Around midnight, I woke up to use the bathroom. As I walked past the locked room on the main floor, I paused for a second. There was no sound, no movement, but I remember getting this strange feeling standing there in the hallway, like someone might be behind that door. I shook it off, used the bathroom, and went back to bed. My girlfriend asked why I'd been gone so long, and I told her I just couldn't find the light switch at first. I didn't mention the uneasy feeling. By the third night, the air in the cabin felt different. It's hard to explain, but I started noticing little things that didn't line up. In the morning, a chair at the kitchen table looked like it had been pulled out slightly, even though neither of us had sat there. My girlfriend said she thought she'd heard footsteps the night before, but she wasn't sure if it was just the old wood creaking. We tried to laugh it off, saying maybe the place was just settling or the wind had made noises outside. But deep down, I think both of us felt uneasy about the locked room. That night, I couldn't sleep. The snow outside had picked up again, and the cabin felt colder than before, even with the fire going. I kept hearing faint noises, little cracks and taps, but I told myself it was just branches shifting under the weight of snow. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I finally dozed off. That's when I heard it. A dull, steady thump. Then another. Then another. It wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate, like someone knocking gently from the other side of that locked door. I froze in bed, listening. My girlfriend stirred beside me, then sat up. She whispered that she heard it too, except she said it didn't sound like knocking to her. It sounded like muffled voices, as if people were talking behind the door, low and hushed. I wanted to tell her she was imagining things, but I couldn't, because I had heard the thumps as clearly as anything. They came about every 10 seconds, spaced apart, not loud but unmistakable. I forced myself to get out of bed and walk to the hallway. I stood there staring at the locked door, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thumps stopped as soon as I got close. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, heavy and pressing, like whoever or whatever was inside knew I was right there. I didn't touch the door, couldn't. I just stood there for a few seconds, then backed away slowly. I went back to the bedroom and told my girlfriend to get dressed. We didn't argue, we didn't hesitate. Both of us knew we had to leave. We grabbed our bags as fast as we could, half-zipped, shoving clothes and chargers inside without folding them. My girlfriend kept glancing at the locked room as if expecting the door to swing open at any moment. The cabin was dead silent again, but every creak of the floorboards made us jump. By the time we got to the car, my hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys in the snow. I didn't even bother brushing them off before starting the engine. The drive out was brutal. The snowstorm had gotten worse, and the narrow road out of the woods was slippery. Branches bent low over the path, and the headlights barely cut through the white. But I didn't care. I drove with both hands locked on the wheel, teeth clenched, just needing to get away from that cabin. My girlfriend sat stiffly in the passenger seat, silent, staring straight ahead. We didn't talk until we were miles away, when the snow finally let up and the main highway came into view. We got home around noon the next day. Neither of us slept after leaving. The whole drive, I kept replaying the sound of those thumps in my head, trying to convince myself it could have been something harmless. Pipes, maybe, or wood shifting. But pipes don't make noises like that. Not in a rhythm, not spaced apart like someone moving with intention. Out of curiosity, I pulled up the rental site later that evening, wanting to read the listing again. Maybe see if other guests had mentioned strange things in their reviews. But when I searched for it, it was gone. The entire listing had been removed, like it never existed. I even went through my booking history and clicked the link to the property. It just showed a blank page that said, "This listing is no longer available." I sat there staring at the screen, feeling my chest tighten. Places don't just vanish overnight unless something serious happened. I thought about the locked room, the thumps, the muffled voices my girlfriend swore she heard. Someone had been in there. I'm sure of it now. Maybe the host kept people there. Maybe someone broke in and was hiding, I don't know. But someone was behind that locked door those nights. We never got an explanation. The host didn't respond to my messages, and I didn't push it. We agreed not to contact the police because what could we even say? That we heard noises behind a locked door in a rental cabin? Without proof, it would sound like paranoia. But I know what I heard. I know what we both felt in that house. That was months ago, and I still think about it all the time. I think about how the noises stopped when I stood in the hallway, like whoever was behind that door knew I was listening. I think about how the listing disappeared, like someone wanted to erase it to make sure nobody else asked questions. And most of all, I think about what might have happened if we'd stayed, if we'd ignored the sounds, if we'd brushed it off as nothing and gone back to sleep. We left at 4 in the morning because we didn't want answers, we just wanted out. But sometimes I wonder if the people who stayed there before us ever made it out at all. When I first unlocked the door to the cabin, I didn't think much of the place. It was small, just a single-story wooden structure with a porch that looked out over the trees. I had booked it for a weekend to get away from work, hoping to clear my head and maybe do some writing. It was the kind of place you'd expect. Rustic furniture, wood-paneled walls, an old fireplace that looked like it had been used 1,000 times before. The air smelled faintly of pine and ash. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet you only find far away from town. After unloading my bag and groceries, I noticed the little guest book on the coffee table. It was bound in a cheap leather cover, the pages filled with handwriting in different colors of ink. I flipped through it out of curiosity. Most of the notes were what you'd expect. Couples writing about how peaceful it was, families thanking the host, people mentioning good fishing or hiking spots nearby. Then I reached an entry that froze me for a moment. Someone is coming into the cabin at night. Don't leave the windows open. That was all it said. No date beyond the month and year, no explanation. Just that. I stared at it longer than I meant to, then turned the page. A couple entries later, another note caught me. They stole my phone charger. Heard someone breathing in the hallway. This one was dated 2 months after the first. I kept flipping after that, but my mood had shifted. The rest of the pages went back to normal. People describing the lake, grilling outside, catching fish. Nobody else mentioned anything strange. Still, the words stuck with me. I set the book down and walked through the cabin again, checking the locks. The front door had a flimsy knob lock and a sliding bolt. The back door to the deck had only a simple lock that felt like it could be jimmied open with a butter knife. The windows were old, the kind that latch shut but don't really feel secure. I made a note to double-check them before bed. The first night was uneventful. I cooked pasta, drank a couple beers, and read a little by the lamp near the couch. By 10, I was in bed. I remember lying there, listening to the stillness outside. It was the kind of silence that made every little noise sound louder. The settling of the wood, the hum of the fridge in the other room, the faint rush of wind through the trees. I drifted off, uneasy but tired enough to sleep. The second night was different. I had gone for a walk by the lake during the day, came back to make dinner, and sat by the fire for a while. When I was finally ready for bed, I checked the windows one by one. They were all latched tight. I pushed on each to be sure. I locked the doors too. Then I left the bedroom light on, just a dim glow, and lay down. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke up cold. At first I thought I had kicked the blanket off, but when I opened my eyes, I saw that the window beside the bed was cracked open. The curtains moved slightly with the air, a faint chill brushing against my skin. I sat up fast. I knew I had locked it. I remembered testing the latch with my thumb. Now it was slid up 2 inches. I shut it quickly, pressed the latch back into place, and stood there for a long time listening. The house made little groans as the wood cooled, but beneath that, I thought I heard something else. A creak from the other side of the cabin. It was faint, but clear, like weight shifting on an old floorboard. I stayed still, holding my breath, ears straining. Nothing followed. Eventually, I climbed back into bed, though I didn't sleep well. Every little sound jolted me awake. By morning, I felt drained, the kind of exhaustion that makes everything seem just a little unreal. That day, I kept thinking about the guestbook entries. The warning about leaving windows open. The note about hearing breathing in the hallway. I told myself it was probably just a prank. Maybe some past guests wanted to freak out whoever came next. But the open window was harder to explain. I convinced myself maybe I hadn't latched it as tightly as I thought. Old windows can slide loose if they're not secured properly. That was possible. I clung to that. The third night, I decided I wasn't taking chances. I locked every window and door again, then pulled a chair under the back door handle. I left the hallway light on this time, too. The cabin glowed faintly with yellow light, shadows stretching into corners. I told myself I'd sleep better with light, but the truth was it only made me more aware of how alone I was out there. At some point in the early hours, maybe around 2, I woke to a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the creak of floorboards again, but this time it was closer, steady. Slow footsteps moving across the cabin. My chest tightened, breath caught in my throat. I lay still, trying not to make a sound, ears straining. The steps came from the living room, then stopped. Silence stretched, but I swore I could hear something faint. The sound of breathing. Not mine. Deeper, heavier, just outside the bedroom door. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Every muscle tensed. The doorknob didn't move, and eventually the sound faded, replaced by silence again. I don't know how long I lay awake, staring at the window, waiting for something else. Eventually, light started to seep around the curtains, and morning came. I didn't even eat breakfast. I packed my bag, shoved everything into the car, and left the cabin behind without looking back. The whole drive back, I tried to reason through it. Maybe it was my imagination, fed by the guestbook and the open window. Maybe the wood creaked in patterns that sounded like footsteps. But the breathing, there was no mistaking that. Someone had been inside. I didn't find anything missing, but that almost made it worse. Whoever it was hadn't come to steal. Back home, I couldn't stop replaying the sound in my head. The slow, deliberate steps, the weight on the boards, the pause by the door. It wasn't the noise of a house shifting. It was a person moving. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that the entries in the guestbook weren't jokes. Others had noticed the same thing. Someone out there knew about that cabin, knew when it was rented, and had been slipping in at night. Not to rob, not to vandalize, just to be there, moving through the rooms while people slept. That was what unsettled me most. The thought that while I lay in bed with my eyes closed, someone else stood only a few feet away, breathing quietly in the dark. And if I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't heard it, I would never have known. I'll never rent a remote cabin again. That weekend cured me of the idea completely. Every time I think of it now, I imagine how close that person must have been, and how many nights they might have done the same thing to others. The guestbook made sense after that. It wasn't warnings for fun. It was the only way people could leave behind a message that something was wrong. For me, the worst part isn't what happened. It's knowing I'll never really know who was in there, or what they wanted, or why they chose that cabin. All I know is that the window had been opened from the inside, the floorboards creaked under someone else's weight, and the breathing was real. I left before finding out more, and I'm glad I did, because if I'd stayed one more night, I'm not sure I would have left at all.